This story wasn't mine. It was told to me by an old man who used to frequent the convenience store where I worked many years ago. Even now, all these years later, whenever I think back to that night, to when I followed him to the scrapyard, the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. A cold shiver runs down my spine, even though the weather might be anything but chilly. The store was in a quiet part of town, not the kind of place you'd find much in the way of crime. The pay was lousy, but it helped me get through college. The night shifts were dead, gave me plenty of time to read or surf the net. You might think that we, the cashiers, don't really pay attention to the customers, but we do. We notice everything. It's just, we usually don't care. We can tell who's about to pull out a wad of cash, or the look of desperate, almost greasy, longing on the face of the young guy buying condoms at 11 at night. And then there was this old man. He came in every Friday night, regular as clockwork. Same faded flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, same carefully counted coins, doled out with the reluctance of a man who knew the value of a hard-earned dollar. He was polite enough, always said hello, never forgot to thank me before leaving with his purchase. Hunched over with age, but I could sense a wiry strength beneath the surface. And he always bought the same thing, a single carton of milk and a sleeve of those cheap store-brand cookies. An odd choice for an old man, I thought. For a favorite grandchild, perhaps, but I never saw him with anyone else. Boredom amplifies the mundane. During those long, drawn-out evenings, I counted the cracks in the ceiling tiles, arranged the merchandise into strange shapes, looked for patterns in the repeating squares of the linoleum floor. This strange man preoccupied my thoughts. Milk and cookies, a child's treat, and yet bought so late in the evening. Was he reliving some distant memory of his own childhood as he indulged in those sugary treats? A creeping sense of dread began to worm its way into my mind. Perhaps he was a deranged pervert, kidnapping young girls and keeping them locked in his basement. Week after week, we exchanged pleasantries, goods exchanged for money. I couldn't figure him out. I couldn't read anything in his rheumy eyes, his shaking hands, or his slow, shuffling gait. I couldn't stand the mystery any longer. I decided to follow him. It took me a few weeks to work up the courage. I'd poke my head out to watch him walk down the street as far as the first corner. Then I'd lock the front door and trail him to the next. And so on. Until one day, right after the old man made his usual purchase, I acted on my impulse. Locking up quickly, I followed him at a distance, never getting too close, never letting him get more than a block ahead. I felt like I was doing something forbidden, like a kid playing hooky. The old man never suspected a thing. Streetlights cast long, distorted shadows of us both as I followed him through the darkened streets. His destination was an old, run-down junkyard, almost a dump, really. Rusted chains rattled as he pulled gently on the gate. Not much worth stealing here, I thought. The old man entered with a confidence that surprised me, and I had to scramble to catch up. I quickly lost sight of him in the maze of discarded junk, lost among society's refuse. The lights and sounds of the city faded. A sliver of a moon hanging high above cast everything in an eerie silver light. Fear, pure and primal, bubbled up within me, only a heartbeat away, amidst the unnerving alien landscape. Just as I was about to give up, I stumbled into a small clearing. The old man was sitting there on the ground, a crooked smile revealing yellowed teeth. "Took you long enough, son," he said. I stopped short, unsure of how to respond. "Come now, boy. Nothing to be afraid of here. I reckon you're curious. That's why you're here. Didn't get into any trouble, did you? The store owner trusts me. She knows I wouldn't steal, and I can close up shop early if there are no customers. So few customers that you have to spend your Friday nights following an old man like me? He laughed, a dry, crackling sound punctuated by wheezing coughs. I come here, he said, pushing himself up with his hands on his knees, to keep a promise, an old promise made a long time ago. I come here every week because it's all I have left. Got no one in this world, no wife, no children, no friends, no job. But a man's got to keep his promises. Without that, well, he's not much of a man at all, is he? I nodded, listening intently. He gestured behind him, shifting to the side so I could see. A pair of faded wooden doors protruded from the refuse, looking for all the world like the entrance to some ancient tomb. The old man pulled one of the doors open, the groaning of the hinges echoing in the stillness. Even from a distance, I could see how thick the door was. I moved closer now. The old man placed the milk and cookies just beyond the threshold and then slammed the door shut. He extended a hand and introduced himself as Miller. He didn't say if it was his first or last name. Back of an old refrigerated truck, he said, patting the door. The solid thunk it made reminded me once again of the thickness of the walls. I reckon you're curious as to why I come here every week. It's a long story, and I ain't never told it to nobody. I'm an old man now, not long for this world. Bones ache when it rains, and it's been raining more and more lately. Maybe it's time someone knew. His voice seemed stronger now, deep and resonant, instead of the frail, reedy whisper from earlier. Happened a long time ago before the Second World War. I was just a kid then, too young to go fight. Maybe 9, 10 years old, something like that. We didn't have none of them fancy toys and computers. Whatchamacallits you got nowadays. He pronounced the unfamiliar word slowly, his jaw working around the syllables. Back then, us kids, we made our own fun, played wherever we could. Cowboys and Indians, cops and robbers. Didn't have no TVs neither. That was something only rich folks had. This junkyard, it's been here longer than I have. We built forts on the trash heaps, played war games, all the things kids do. This one day we were playing hide and seek, old game, but it suited a place like this just fine. I weren't no big kid, lost at most games, but I was determined to win this one. I'd seen this big old refrigerated truck before, right on the edge of the junkyard, and I knew just the place to hide. I was small, but quick. Look at me now. But back then, I was off and running before they even got to 20. Didn't want nobody else hiding with me. It was pitch black in there, and cold. I could make out a few shapes, things that had fallen in over time, before the door closed. Last thing I remember was a sliver of daylight before I pulled this here door shut. At first it was just the sound of my own breathing echoing in the small space. I imagined I'd be winning at hide and seek forever. Counted my breaths, my heartbeats, until I got bored. That's when I realized there weren't no handle on the inside. I could see his hands starting to tremble now, remembering a fear long past. He clenched them into fists to stop the shaking, and when his knuckles turned white, he shoved his hands deep into his pockets. Took me a while to realize the game was over. I was in the dark for a long time, a long time. I pounded on the door until I couldn't feel my fist no more. Kicked at it too, until my toes were bloody. Yelled until my throat was raw. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, as if trying to dislodge the memory. Then I just sat down and waited. Must have fallen asleep. How can you tell if you're sleeping when you're alone in the dark? You can't, son. You just can't. First I was thirsty, then I was hungry. That's the only way I knew time was passing. I felt hope draining away like the setting sun. I screamed into the darkness. I begged God, but he didn't answer. I swear I would have begged the devil too, if I thought it would do any good. I cried. I cried for hours in the dark, my sobs bouncing off those thick walls, until the whole place was filled with the sound of my tears and snot. I thought I was going to die. You ever come close to dying, son? No, sir. I shook my head. He looked me straight in the eye, his almost opaque eyes suddenly sharp. No, I didn't think so. I can tell when a man's looked death in the face. He's never quite the same. At first, I thought it was an echo, but I swear there was someone else crying with me in there. A little higher pitched, a little further away than my own. It's me, I told myself. I've been in the dark so long I'm going crazy. I counted to 5 and held my breath, but the crying continued. I leaned in closer. The old man was looking at me. It was like he was seeing something far beyond. I called out into the darkness. At first, there was no answer, just a soft whimpering. It was another kid, but not a boy. A girl. I knew I was alone in there. I would have seen her before the door closed. I was scared before, but now a whole different kind of fear crept in. The crying came again. I shrank back into the corner by the door. You ever seen a trapped rat, son, when it tries to get away from you? It was like that. The crying didn't come any closer. I figured, this is it. This is where I die. No one will ever find me, so I called out again. The crying stopped. In the thick darkness, the girl answered, sounded about my age. She said her name was Helen, a pretty name. She'd been trapped in the dark for a long time. She tried calling for help, but no one came. She got hungry. Then she didn't feel hungry no more. She gave up calling, gave up hope of ever seeing her family again, gave up on ever having another friend. The walls, she said, were too thick for the sound to get out, and no one would ever know we were in here. No one would ever find us. At least she wouldn't be alone anymore, because now she had me. I heard her moving in the dark, and she took my hand. It was tiny and cold, like it had been in an icebox for a few minutes, but it was all I had, and I squeezed it tight. I dreamed I heard my name being called outside. I couldn't be sure, not until I pressed my ear to the corner of the door. The seal must have rotted away over time, because I could just make out the sounds from outside. If I could hear them, maybe they could hear me. I tried to yell, but only a dry croak came out. I hadn't had anything to drink in so long. I tried to wet my lips with my tongue, but it was no use. I pounded on the door. The hunger and the thirst had weakened me. I wasn't sure if they could hear me over the banging or not. Hope once again began to fade. That dark box would be the last thing I ever saw, and no one would ever know what happened. I felt Helen's little hand squeeze mine. "Don't go," she said. "Stay. It will be fun. I've been alone for so long." She started pulling me further into the darkness. I couldn't fight her. She was strangely strong. "Please," I whispered. "My mommy and daddy will miss me. I have friends out there." Even as her tiny fingernails dug into my arm, drawing blood, I could feel her sadness through her touch. "I don't have anyone." Her crying started up again, weak and thin in the confined space, so full of despair that it sounded like her heart was breaking. "I can be your friend. Help me. I promise. I'll be your friend forever," I told her, and I meant it. I saw his hand clench into a fist inside his pocket, as if he could still feel that ghostly touch. She let go of my hand, or maybe she was never there at all. I reached up and touched my face. It was still wet. Just then, I heard the door creaking open. I had been found. 2 strong arms scooped me up out of the darkness. The light hurt my eyes, and it took me a while to focus on my rescuers. Someone gave me some water. I drank greedily. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. I've never tasted anything as good since. It was like life itself, you know. They were telling my parents what they knew as I sat there with the big man who'd found me. He kept looking at me kind of funny. Said I was taller than he thought I'd be. Said the voice he heard was much higher, like a little girl's cry. He patted me on the head with his big, rough hand. "Don't you worry about crying, son," he said. "I'd be scared too if I was stuck in there." My parents arrived and the police. They hugged me tight. As we were getting ready to leave, I asked them if they'd found the little girl who was in there with me. The rescuers exchanged confused glances. I was the only one in that refrigerated truck. I refused to leave until they checked again. I caused such a fuss that they just looked at each other in exasperation and took me back to where that big door was. They pulled it open. There was no little girl. The light didn't reach far enough inside. One of the policemen pulled out his flashlight. One of them big silver ones. You don't see them much anymore. The trash from the junkyard had spilled into the back of that old refrigerated truck. It wasn't until the second sweep of the beam that we saw the flash of blue from a little girl's dress. He took a deep breath, his story almost at an end. He seemed to deflate, as if the very act of telling it had drained him of his remaining strength. Of course, the little girl was long dead, dried up like one of them mummies you see in the National Geographic magazines. I think I went a little crazy then, seeing her like that. I don't remember what I said, but no one believed me. They said I'd been in the dark too long enough to drive a boy mad, but I never stopped believing, and I never forgot my promise. 70 years. What happened between us? Well, that's for me to know. I couldn't always get here, but I tried my best, which is more than you can say for most men. He leaned against the door, catching his breath after his story. Then he straightened up, cleared his throat, one hand still resting on the thick metal. "Nighty-night, my friend. I'll see you next week." His voice was clear now, the sound carrying across the junkyard. I started to say goodnight, but then I realized he wasn't looking at me. No, his eyes were fixed on the door I was leaning against. He walked slowly away across the clearing. Strange encounter, I thought. The unease I felt listening to the old man's story began to dissipate. Just a campfire ghost story, nothing more. Just a lonely old man, perhaps a little senile, living in some childhood fantasy. I sighed. The moon was high in the sky. I suppose there were worse ways to kill time on a Friday night. But something bothered me, just as I turned to find my way out of that still place. For the second time that night, the refrigerated truck door creaked open. A cold blast of air hit me in the face. I almost expected to see the skeleton of Helen, still lying there after all these years. There was nothing. I chided myself for my childish fear, chuckled nervously. There was nothing in the empty tomb of the refrigerated truck except for an empty carton of milk and some cookie crumbs. As the sun began its descent, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched across the deserted road, a small figure emerged from a narrow alleyway, a chillingly enigmatic smile playing on her lips. It was Sally, her face still holding the vestiges of childhood innocence, yet her eyes burned with a chilling, calculating gleam that belied her tender years. She had just come from the Ravenswood house, a place shrouded in dark secrets, secrets so unspeakable that they would likely be dismissed as mere folklore by anyone brave enough to hear them whispered. Sally Gregory folded her arms defiantly, her gaze fixed on her brother's group of friends. Samuel, her brother, with his trademark smirk, tossed a baseball high in the air, his eyes challenging. Around him, his schoolmates jeered, their voices a chorus of taunts. "Chicken! Chicken! Sally's a chicken!" They ridiculed her for being a girl, daring her to prove her worth if she wanted to be included in their games. And this time, the test of her courage was to set foot in the dilapidated house perched atop the hill. The house that held the horrors of the Ravenswood family. "Come on, Sal. It's just old man Ravenswood's creepy house. You're not scared, are you?" Samuel goaded, his friends erupting in a cacophony of mock chicken noises. "No, I just don't want to climb the hill." Sally lied, her voice trembling. She was terrified. The tales of old man Ravenswood and his deranged wife had been seared into her young mind. She didn't want to step foot in that attic, no matter how much her brother's friends dared her. But the chance of chicken continued, chipping away at Sally's resolve. Everyone in town knew of the Ravenswood house and the tragedy that had befallen the family. Years ago, the Ravenswoods, a young couple filled with hopes of building a life together, had purchased the dilapidated, rotting Victorian with those dreams in mind. Not long after, Alice gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, Andrew. Then came Henry, a second son, who completed their family. As time passed, the boys grew, always eager to invent new games and find new ways to get into mischief. One sweltering summer day, Andrew and Henry were playing hide-and-seek in the attic amongst the decades-old trunks. Andrew, having hidden first, emerged from his hiding spot after counting to 36 to find Henry curled up inside a trunk filled with their mother's old gowns. But Henry couldn't find Andrew, not after 36 seconds, or 100 seconds, or even 240 seconds. The attic was filled with 30 trunks of various sizes, all filled with remnants of the Ravenswoods' past lives. And in one of those cramped spaces, Andrew giggled, unaware that the air around him was growing thin. Henry, bored with the game, abandoned his search and went downstairs for cookies, forgetting that Andrew was still in the attic. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the moon began to rise, casting its eerie glow through the single window, illuminating the 30 trunks in an unnatural light, Andrew awoke from his hiding spot. He tried to push open the lid of the trunk, but it was stuck. He called out for Henry, his voice muffled by the trunk. He pounded on the lid with his small fists, tears streaming down his face, begging for someone to hear him. But the air grew thinner, and he slipped into the darkness of asphyxiation. By dinner, Andrew was still missing. Mrs. Ravenswood inquired about her eldest son's whereabouts, and upon hearing of the boys' game, both Mr. and Mrs. Ravenswood were in the attic, screaming Andrew's name, frantically unlatching each trunk. Henry stood by, tears in his eyes, a knot of dread twisting in his gut. When the last trunk, a heavy wooden one, was pried open, all that was left was a lifeless, blue-tinged Andrew. They rushed Andrew to the hospital, but it was too late. Alice Ravenswood went mad after the death of her son. She insisted that Andrew be buried in the rose garden so that she could be near him day and night. She wouldn't allow anyone to touch anything in Andrew's room, and she demanded that all of the trunks in the attic be unlocked. Mr. Ravenswood indulged his wife, hopeful that it would bring her some semblance of peace. Alice lived as if Andrew was still alive, making him meals and taking them out to the garden, declaring that they were having a picnic, just the two of them, ignoring Henry entirely. Some even claimed to have seen her sleeping next to Andrew's grave. Months passed, and Alice remained lost in her delusion. Then Henry made a fatal mistake. He snuck up to the attic after dinner, a place no one had dared to enter since Mr. Ravenswood had unlatched the trunks. But strangely enough, there, scrawled across the wall in what could only be described as some sort of ash, was a message, and his brother's name was in it. The 30 trunks were gone, replaced by 2 that stood in the middle of the room, the heavy wooden trunk and a blue one that had held his mother's gowns. Around them, candles flickered, and the moonlight seemed to disappear. Henry turned to run, but ran straight into his mother. "Oh, darling, what are you doing up here?" Mrs. Ravenswood asked in a sickeningly sweet voice. Henry burst into tears. "I'm sorry, Mother, I'm sorry." Mrs. Ravenswood pulled her youngest son into an embrace, stroking his hair. "It's all right, darling. Mommy's sorry, too. Mommy's been neglecting you lately, hasn't she?" she said. Henry nodded, burying his face in his mother's dress. "You can't help it, my love. It was you who killed him," she said. Henry pulled back, looking up at his mother in horror. "Me? Did I really?" the young boy cried. "Yes, darling," Mrs. Ravenswood replied, her eyes glinting with a terrifying madness, blaming her one living child for the death of her other. "I didn't mean to, Mommy," Henry said. "I know you didn't, Henry, I know. But you did. And now you have to make it up to him," Mrs. Ravenswood said, kneeling in front of Henry, pulling him into an embrace. "What do I have to do?" sobbed the boy, innocent and naive, willing to do anything to right what he had done wrong. Mrs. Ravenswood smiled, rising to her feet, taking Henry's hand, leading him past the circle of fire to the 2 trunks. "Mommy needs you, her darling boy, to play with your brother," Mrs. Ravenswood said, opening the blue trunk, now empty. Henry didn't seem to notice that the trunk was no longer locked. He stepped inside, laying down, allowing his mother to close the lid. "Don't forget to count, Mommy," he called out. "Of course, darling." 1, 2, Mrs. Ravenswood said, counting as she walked back, stepping out of the circle of candles, heading down the stairs. Mr. Ravenswood came home late that night after another bender at the local pub. He found his wife sitting in the rocking chair, staring off into space, a ghostly smile on her lips. Henry was nowhere to be found. "Darling, are you all right?" he asked, walking up to her, kissing her cheek. "Oh, I'm fine, just peachy," she replied, her eyes still fixed on the cold fireplace. "Did you put Henry to bed?" Mr. Ravenswood asked, hanging up his coat, sitting down on the rocking chair opposite his wife. He watched her curiously, rocking his chair to the same rhythm as hers. She maintained her vacant smile when she replied, "No, he's playing with Andrew in the attic." Mr. Ravenswood stopped rocking, staring at his wife. She continued to stare at the fireplace. His blood ran cold, and he began to wonder just how far gone his wife truly was. "What did you say, Alice?" he asked, rising to his feet, grabbing his wife's face, forcing her to look at him. She just smiled. "I said I'm so glad you're home, dear." That was all she said. Mr. Ravenswood released his wife's face, running up to the attic, screaming Henry's name. But it was too late. He found Henry, dead in the same manner as his brother. Losing Andrew had been one thing, but to see what his wife had done to their other son, it broke Mr. Ravenswood. He snapped. He retrieved the axe from the shed making his way into the house, where Alice still sat in the rocking chair, smiling that empty smile. "I'm sorry, Alice," he said. "Sorry for what?" Mrs. Ravenswood didn't get to finish her sentence before the axe split her skull. He called the police, confessing to everything. When they arrived at the house that morning, they found him in the attic. He had moved the dining room table and chairs up there and had prepared a lovely breakfast for 4. The candles from the night before had burned out. The trunks were smashed to pieces in the corner, the bloody axe resting on top. There, at the head of the table, Mr. Ravenswood sat calmly, eating his breakfast, next to a rotting Andrew, and across from him sat Henry, his lips blue, his eyes wide with terror, and at the opposite end of the table sat the butchered body of Alice Ravenswood. Mr. Ravenswood went with the police without a fight, even kissing each member of his family, including Andrew, on the cheek, before being restrained and taken to the asylum just on the outskirts of town. When the coroner arrived at the scene, they noted with horror that Mrs. Ravenswood still had that same chilling smile plastered on her face. It was said that Mr. Ravenswood committed suicide in the asylum a few weeks later. The house was left abandoned, no one daring to go near it after that, except for the occasional thrill-seeker, foolish enough to tempt fate. "Chicken! Sally's a chicken! Sally's a chicken!" The final taunt finally broke Sally. She hated being called that, even if it was just harmless teasing. "Fine," she screamed, turning on her heels, marching up the hill towards the Ravenswood house, when something hard hit her in the back of the head. "Ow!" she screamed, turning around to see Samuel struggling to contain his laughter. He had thrown a small, metal flashlight at her. She picked it up as his friends laughed. "Just in case you get scared, little sis," Samuel joked. Sally turned away, continuing her trek up the hill, her mind made up. "I'll show you brats who's scared," she yelled as she walked away, leaving Samuel and his friends' laughter behind. Rage bubbled inside of Sally. She'd show them. The dare itself was simple enough, childish even, if it didn't involve the Ravenswood house. All Sally had to do was go up to the attic and retrieve one of the candles that Mrs. Ravenswood had lit around the trunks. Simple, but not for Sally. The late afternoon sun cast shadows that reminded Sally of that fateful night Andrew and Henry had played hide-and-seek in the attic. She stopped for a moment, retying her ponytail. She couldn't stop thinking about those little boys. Andrew had only been 6 when he died. She didn't know for sure, because the Ravenswoods were said to be buried in another town cemetery, with no dates to be found. The only proof that any of it was real was the creepy lore and the dilapidated house on the hill. It was why she assumed it was all made up. And after Andrew had died, the father had gone mad, and Alice and Henry had moved away. They weren't dead. They were living in a new town, where no one knew the name Ravenswood. Sally continued on her way, pushing up the sleeves of her shirt. She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't have tagged along with her brother when he went to the baseball field. They never let her play anyway. She was their age. She knew how to play baseball. But to those jerks, she was just a girl. Which is why she had accepted the dare. She had to prove that she was just as brave and strong as they were. Sally reached the front gate of the house, the wood rotting from years of neglect. She peered through the small opening in the gate. The stone walkway leading up to the house was overgrown with weeds. She stepped through the opening, her eyes scanning her surroundings. There was a garden, with wild roses growing with the tenacity of weeds. A few feet away, just as the stories said, was a dilapidated shed, its doors hanging precariously from their hinges. Finally, Sally looked up at the house and gasped, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. There, in the small circular attic window, was a woman who had probably been very beautiful once, but now she looked horrifying. She had long, tangled black hair, piercing blue eyes surrounded by dark circles. That wasn't what made her terrifying. What made Sally's knees want to buckle and her mouth run dry was the grotesque smile plastered across the woman's face and the gash in her neck. Blood seeped out, nearly severing her head from her body. The woman raised her left hand, waving at Sally, and glinting in the sunlight, like some sort of sick joke, was her wedding ring. Sally screamed, a blood-curdling scream, as Mrs. Alice Ravenswood began to laugh. Samuel pitched the baseball to Trevor Green, his best friend and right-hand man in their group. The other boys had gotten bored with baseball, deciding to wrestle in the grass instead. The Beauregard brothers, Tim and Ted, were rolling around. Tim had Ted in a headlock. There were 5 of them in total. The last one, Desmond Burnham, sat on a nearby rock. They all lived on the same street, were in the same class, went to the same church, and had been friends since they were old enough to walk and talk. They were as thick as thieves, and they terrorized their small town on a regular basis. But they didn't care. They were friends, and they would always have each other's backs, no matter what. Trevor caught the ball, but he didn't throw it back. He looked up at the setting sun, then back at Samuel. "Hey, Sam, how long do you think Sal will be? It's almost dinner, and my dad will have my hide if I'm not home before dark," he said, finally tossing the ball back to Samuel. "Yeah, my parents too. When will she be back?" Ted chimed in, getting up, dusting himself off. He'd won the wrestling match. Tim stood beside him, pointing at the stain on his white t-shirt. "Look what you did to my shirt, Ted." "Mom's going to kill me," Tim whined, trying to rub out the stain. Ted rolled his eyes. They all looked at Samuel now. He tossed the baseball up in the air, watching as the setting sun caught it. His gray eyes glinted in the dying sunlight, and he turned to look at his friends. "Hey, Des, how long has Sally been gone?" Samuel asked. Des jumped down from the rock. He ran a hand through his hair, shrugging. "An hour, maybe," he replied. Samuel took off his mitt, tossing both the ball and the mitt to Trevor to put away in his bag. Trevor had gotten a brand new bag last week for his birthday, and was now the keeper of all their gear. "All right, Trev, you can head home with Tim and Ted so you don't get yelled at," Samuel said. Then pointing at Des, he asked, "You want to come with me to get Sally, or are your parents going to freak out?" Des shrugged, a common occurrence for the boy. "I'm good, Sammy," he replied. "Thanks, Sammy," Trevor said, slinging the baseball bag over his shoulder, still holding the ball and his mitt. Ted and Tim stood beside him. Des walked over to Samuel's side. "See you guys tomorrow if Sally doesn't get you killed first," Ted yelled as the two groups split up, heading in opposite directions. A joke, of course. When Des and Samuel reached the Ravenswood house, it was eerily quiet. The wooden gate didn't even creak when Samuel leaned on it to look in the window. There were no crunching leaves as Des stood next to Samuel, no chirping crickets, no howling wind, nothing. Samuel hesitantly walked to the opening, where he saw a single shoe, Sally's shoe. Des, who had been trailing behind, stopped dead in his tracks when he saw it. Samuel walked over, picking up the shoe, his face paling considerably. "Samuel, I think we should just go," Des said, his voice shaking. He was staring at the attic window, where he could see a faint light flickering. as if the attic was lit by candlelight. "Sam, we need to go," he repeated, backing away. "Sally!" Samuel yelled, seeing the faint light in the attic window. He ran toward the house, dropping the shoe. "No, Sam, wait!" Des yelled after him, chasing after Samuel. He stepped inside the house, a foul stench assaulting his nostrils. It was the kind of smell you'd associate with spoiled milk. Des had to stop, gagging, trying to get a breath of fresh air, but it was no use. Samuel had already turned the corner. Des followed behind. "Sam," he called out, but Samuel was already halfway up the stairs. Des followed behind. As they reached the landing, Des grabbed Samuel's shoulder. "Sam, we have to get out of here," Des said, as the lights flickered on, old dying light, casting a sickly yellow glow on the walls. They both jumped at the sound of a scream. "Help me!" Sally screamed. Samuel spun around, heading down the hallway, towards the stairs that led up to the attic. Des grabbed him, stopping him. "Are you crazy, Sam? We have to go," Des said. Samuel was crying now. "But it's all my fault, Des," Samuel said, pushing past Des, heading towards the attic stairs. Des knew something was wrong, that something terrible was about to happen. He ran a hand through his hair, looking around. Everything was rotting, the wallpaper peeling off, the carpet old and stained. You could practically feel the death clinging to this place as a chill settled in your bones, despite the summer heat. Des felt like his heart was going to beat out of his chest. This was wrong. Why had they dared Sally to come to a place like this? Des chased after Samuel. He knew he couldn't leave his friend behind. He understood why Samuel was so determined to save Sally, despite the gnawing feeling that she was already gone. The house held its breath, bearing witness to the plight of the 3 children, none older than 11. Unlike adults, with their ability to comprehend the unimaginable horrors that lurked around every corner, these children were surprisingly calm, completely oblivious. It was both tragic and brave. Samuel stopped at the last step, shivering from the sudden drop in temperature and the thought of what lay beyond the door. In the time it took Des to catch up to Samuel, summer had turned to winter, reality to nightmare, and their childhood shattered. It was the final choice: face what awaited them inside, or run and live with the guilt of leaving Sally Gregory behind. Samuel went to open the door, but it swung open on its own. Des didn't leave Samuel's side as they both stepped into the attic. The sun had set, the only light coming from the window. But it wasn't the dying sunlight that illuminated the dingy attic. It was the circle of candles. And to the boys' horror, there were 2 large trunks, but they weren't the trunks from the story. These were black, and admittedly much larger. The kind of trunk that could fit a woman of average height. The kind that could fit an 11, almost 12-year-old boy. "Hello, boys. It's time to play our game." Both Des and Samuel's vision went black as they both felt the searing pain in the back of their heads. Samuel came to slowly and immediately began to scream. He was in the trunk. He pounded his fists on the lid, kicking and pushing, hoping it would pop open. "Help me," he screamed, tears streaming down his face. He was trapped in the small, confined space, surrounded by darkness. Except Samuel felt something in his pocket. He reached into it, pulling out a small, metal flashlight that made his blood run cold. It was an ordinary flashlight, just like any other, but Samuel Gregory knew who it belonged to. Des came to as well, but unlike Samuel, he lay silently in the darkness, accepting his fate. Sally, however, was enjoying a lovely dinner with all 3 Ravenswoods, not in any danger. or distress whatsoever. At first, Sally had been scared too. Who wouldn't be? But she wasn't a quitter, especially after being called chicken by a bunch of immature boys. So instead of letting her fear consume her, Sally had walked up to the attic of the abandoned house and said hello to Mrs. Ravenswood and her two sons, wide smiles on their blue-tinged lips at the thought of another brother. Of course, Sally hadn't planned on Des coming to her rescue, but two was better than one, right? They just needed one more trunk. Then they'd be set. Mrs. Ravenswood seemed pleased with this arrangement, even inviting Sally to join their ghostly dinner. Of course, Sally didn't eat the food. She just sat at the table, which had already been set in the attic. Mrs. Ravenswood was very impressed with Sally, understanding even. After dinner, she walked Sally to the door, making her promise to come back and visit, and Sally agreed, with no intention of keeping that promise. Sally casually walked away, leaving the Ravenswood house behind. On her way back, she practiced her crying, rehearsing the lie she had concocted in her head. Des and Samuel had gone to get her from the Ravenswood house, and on their way back, some man had shown up, grabbing them, while Sally managed to escape. She pulled her shirt out of her skirt and took off one of her shoes, holding it in her hand. She'd toss it when she got closer to her street. A nice touch, Sally thought. It would make it seem as if Mrs. Ravenswood had snatched her from the sidewalk in front of her house. Of course, Sally didn't regret leaving Des and Samuel for Mrs. Ravenswood to take care of. Well, she felt a little bad for Des. She hadn't meant for him to stay, but he had inserted himself into her game. "Who's the chicken now, boys?" Sally muttered under her breath, picturing the two boys trapped in the trunks, the air growing thin. She'd be the new leader of their group, even if she was a girl. She figured they'd need a new pitcher, and Sally was the second best, after Samuel. She'd have to find a replacement for Des, but she knew another girl who was a tomboy, just like her, who wouldn't mind joining their group. The boys would get used to having girls in their group. She was sure of it. Sally began to fake cry when she was a few blocks away from her street and tossed her shoe, then broke into a run for the rest of the way, the sounds of victory drumming in her head. Sally Gregory was not one to be trifled with. Everyone carries tales of the strange and bizarre. This is the story of how a half-whole mass saved my life, and continues to do so to this very day. It was late December, the air thick with the anticipation of Christmas, when I was driving home to Oregon from California. A heavy snowstorm, the kind that seems to appear out of nowhere, descended upon the mountain pass. My snow tires gripped the asphalt, but the relentless snow and the rapidly dwindling daylight filled me with a primal unease. The heater in my old car whined like a wounded animal, battling the encroaching cold. Finding shelter became less of a desire and more of a necessity. Miles stretched into an eternity of white before a weathered sign, barely visible through the snowdrifts, declared the nearest town a daunting one 62 miles away. Despair gnawed at my resolve. At 1:21 a.m., with the storm raging unabated, I made a desperate decision. The next turnoff, any sign of civilization, would be my sanctuary for the night. 30 agonizing minutes later, 2 weathered wooden posts materialized through the swirling snow, marking an unmarked, unpaved road. Hope, fragile as an icicle, bloomed in my chest. The headlights soon illuminated a small cabin, shrouded in darkness but seemingly intact. I pulled up under the skeletal branches of a gnarled tree, its silhouette a menacing guardian against the storm. Pulling my half-whole mask up, the rough fabric a comforting barrier against the biting wind, I approached the cabin, my breath frosting in the air. An unsettling silence hung over the place. No welcoming lights, no tire tracks in the snow, no sign of life whatsoever. I knocked, my voice swallowed by the wind, and repeated my pleas. Each one met with an unnerving quiet. The doorknob turned with a disconcerting ease, the only sound a low groan of ancient wood. Announcing my presence to the empty air, I stepped inside, the darkness closing behind me like a tomb. The cabin's interior was shrouded in an oppressive gloom. 5 rooms, barely discernible in the darkness. A living room, a cramped kitchen, a smaller washroom, and 2 bedrooms at the back. I fumbled for my phone, its feeble light revealing nothing but bare walls and unsettlingly ordinary paintings. One painting, however, snagged my attention. A family, frozen in time. A mother, a father, a teenage girl with hauntingly beautiful features, and a small child. Their faces, except for the girl's, were unnervingly smooth, devoid of any features, like porcelain masks. The unsettling image lingered as I checked the time, past 2 a.m. Exhaustion outweighed my growing unease. The back bedroom, empty save for a bed and simple furniture, seemed as good a place as any to wait out the storm. I burrowed under the covers, pulling my mask up for warmth. Setting my alarm for 4:30 a.m., I closed my eyes, surrendering to a sleep haunted by faceless figures and a gnawing sense of dread. A soft scratching sound coming from the closet ripped me from my sleep. My blood turned to ice. I lay still, every muscle screaming in protest, as the scratching grew louder, more insistent, before abruptly ceasing. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with an unseen menace. Then, the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Terror, raw and consuming, threatened to overwhelm me. A desiccated head, perched atop an elongated skeletal neck, emerged from the closet's dark maw. The creature, for that's what it was, crawled out, its movements eerily graceful, and stood, its form nearly touching the ceiling. It had no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to devour the surrounding darkness. Yet, it turned towards me, its bony hand gripping the edge of the bed. Strange. It rasped, its voice a dry whisper that seemed to cling to the air. It has no fear of me. A wave of dizziness swept over me. Was this the end? Would my story end here, forgotten in this snow-covered cabin? How can it not fear? How can it not fear me? The creature's voice rose in volume, its skeletal fingers tightening on the bed frame. Suddenly it recoiled, a gasp escaping its fleshless lips. It has no face, it breathed, more to itself than to me. It has no face. It has no face. The creature backed away, its voice rising in a crescendo of terror. It paced, agitated, its ragged breaths filling the room, before slowly approaching the bed once more. It leaned over me, its putrid stench, the undeniable reek of decay, making my stomach churn. I held my breath, praying my mask hid the tremor of fear that ran through me. Strange, it whispered again, its rancid breath washing over me. A bony hand, its touch icy cold, reached towards my face. My mind raced. This was it. This was how I died. Images of loved ones flashed before my eyes, their faces blurring with tears I couldn't shed. No face, no face, no face, the creature chanted, its voice a low, mournful drone. Its hand hovered inches from my face. Then salvation arrived in the most unexpected form. My phone, its alarm blaring, shattered the silence. The creature shrieked, a sound of pure primal fear, and scrambled back, throwing itself against the wall as the insistent beeping continued. I reacted instinctively, grabbing my phone and shining its light on the monstrous figure. The creature cowered, its cries echoing in the small room. I switched the light to strobe, the disorienting flashes adding to its terror. "No face, no face, no face," it shrieked, retreating towards the closet. I pressed my advantage, the music from my phone now a weapon against the encroaching darkness. With a final despairing wail of "no face, it has no face," the creature vanished into the closet's depths. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Adrenaline surged through me. I fled, my heart pounding against my ribs, not stopping until I reached the relative safety of my car. As I sped away, the first rays of dawn painting the snow-covered landscape a pale gold, I finally allowed myself to break down. I cried, tears of relief, of terror, of the sheer exhaustion of cheating death. But as the sun rose higher, chasing away the shadows of the night, a shaky laugh escaped my lips. I was alive. I had survived. After I finished with my whole episode of crying and laughing like an insane person, I entered the store, sniffling and wiping away the rest of my tears. As I continued into the store, the cashier looked up at me and traced my direction with his eyes before continuing with what he was doing. The store was mostly empty. Besides an elderly couple, I was the only customer in there. "Had a rough night?" the cashier said with one eyebrow cocked up while he scanned my items. "You have no idea," I said, looking out the window at the sunny winter day. "I noticed you looked a bit upset when you came in. What happened? Did you get dumped or something?" he said, looking up at me as the register computed how much I owed him. Looking at the young man behind the register, he seemed to be a little younger than I was. Although that doesn't say much because even though I'm 22, I look younger than my actual age. I looked at the cashier's name tag for a second before feeling that I had nothing to lose by telling him about the night I just had. The small name on his ID tag read Evan, and as I finished telling him my frightening tale, something odd happened. I expected him to burst out laughing or say I was the best liar he had ever talked to. Instead of doing any of that, Evan just stood there, his skin milk white as he stared at me with an expression so horrified, he gave me the impression that he'd just witnessed someone get run over by a train or something. "Evan, are you all right?" I said, looking into his eyes, while we both stood there quiet. "What? Oh, yeah, it's just..." Evan began to say before his thoughts trailed off due to the new feeling that we were both being watched. I began to feel eyes burn into the back of my head before turning around to see the old couple I glanced at when I entered the store beforehand. The old couple possessed the same horrified look that Evan had just a few seconds ago. They must have heard the whole story I told. After a few moments of silence, the old couple asked me what I knew about the cabin, to which I couldn't really say. I gave them the best description I could about what I saw. The couple proceeded to tell me about the cabin, how long it's been there, and that it was haunted by a presence so terrifying that the place was condemned and left to rot away after so many people disappeared there. They told me that no one who ever stayed in that cabin has ever been seen alive again, if they've ever been seen at all after their visit. One of my best friends stayed the night in that cabin, Evan said quietly as he stared off into the distance, but continued his thoughts with, "I refused to go into the cabin. I knew something bad would happen if we went in. I tried so hard to convince him that the dare was stupid and to not go in, but he refused to be labeled as a chicken and continued with the dare." Evan's eyes began to water, as he continued with his story. I never saw him again after that night. I kept calling his house, but his parents still couldn't find him. We put out flyers and billboards, but we never had any luck. After a few days, we contacted the police, and I told them about the cabin. Evan began to choke down tears as he clenched his fist. They found him in the basement of that cabin, sprawled out on the floor. His eyes were surgically removed from his eye sockets. His nose was removed, and his lips. They were sliced off. When they found him, he was naked with an incision from the bottom of his rib cage to his pelvis down the middle of his body. All of the internal organs were extracted from his body, and to add insult to injury, his genitals were sliced clean off. But you want to know the worst part of it all? When the police did an autopsy on the body, they found that he was alive during the whole process. Evan winced as he remembered the whole gruesome sight and said they never found who or what did it. There was no DNA evidence to convict anybody. They didn't find the tools that made the incisions, and they didn't find anything. Evan clenched his fist tighter on the table before the old man, listening to our conversation, put his hand on Evan's shoulder to reassure him that it was going to be all right. As he comforted Evan, he looked at me and said, "People have been disappearing from that area for decades, maybe even centuries for all we know, but the bodies always end the same gruesome way. I don't care who you are. No one deserves something like that happening to them. They should just torch that evil place to the ground." The old lady joined her husband's side and looked at me with the most foreboding face I had ever seen. "If your story is true, you should consider yourself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. In all my years of living, you are the only one to go into that cabin and come out alive," the woman said, gripping onto her husband's hand tightly as she spoke to me. After hearing the old woman's words, I realized that Evan said the body of his friend was found in the basement, which explains why the monster's voice got fainter. It would have pulled me into the basement if my phone hadn't gone off. I quickly paid for my items and left the store more troubled now than I was when I entered. Feeling drowsy due to the lack of sleep and constant adrenaline rush caused by my whole terrible ordeal, I decided to go to a hotel and spend the day sleeping and relaxing to get my mind off things. That night, I sat on the bed in my hotel room and looked at the two items that saved my life. In one hand, I gripped onto my half-whole mask, which hid my face from that terrible monster. In my other hand, I held my cell phone, which scared away the horrible beast that could have killed me. I decided that from that day on, I would always wear my half-whole mask to bed. It saved my life. That's the least I can do for it. The recent brush with death I just experienced had taught me that life is too precious to waste. So I decided to ask my best friend Samantha out on a date, and things worked perfectly. Samantha and I were together for 2 years before I recently asked for her hand in marriage, which she said yes. Part of me will never forget that awful night, and because of it, not only have I been wearing my half-whole mask to bed every night since then, I've also made it a priority not to live in any type of house that has a basement. As an added safety measure, I started locking every door before going to bed. It's a pain, but you can never be too careful. Despite these crazy precautions, Samantha has accepted my little quirks and has continued to be supportive as we continue or journey through life together. I couldn't be happier with the way things turned out in my life, and I'm so lucky to be with Samantha. Everything's perfect. There's just one thing that bothers me, and I think I might just have to blame my imagination, but sometimes when I wake up at night, when it's really quiet, sometimes I'll hear soft scratching noises. Also, and I think it's just paranoia, but I swear sometimes I hear something whisper, "No face," from inside my closet. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope you found it chilling and suspenseful. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I'm always on the lookout for the most intriguing and terrifying tales to share. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload.